Hello everybody, it's Joe Morgans here with another tutorial. Basically what we're going to be doing is taking out a motor and then putting it back in again. So, sounds a bit pointless, but that's what we're going to be doing just for demonstration purposes. So you might want to do that so you can take your Group 12 or C-cam motor, rebuild it and then put it back in the car. And I'm just going to show you how to do that basically. So you're going to need some tools, so I'll just run through what I've got. I've got a phenolic block. You can have a metal block, that'll work fine, but a plastic block won't work because that'll just overheat and melt, which isn't ideal. But yeah, this particular block's got magnets on it, so it holds the car down nice and flat, so it makes it easy to put the motor in. Other tools, I've got pliers for some reason. I guess, well, if you need to straighten the chassis when you put the motor back in, it helps it keep it nice and flat. This is just a flathead screwdriver, but you can use anything really. Sometimes I might use this for trying to sort of pry the motor out without breaking it, obviously. Another way of taking the motor out is by using a blade. So you see on this car, what I would do is, if it will focus, bear with me. No, ain't gonna work. Well, basically what I would do is heat up this soldering joint, and from this side, and slide the blade in there, and that would break the soldering joint. And then all you got to do is heat this one up, and the motor will just fall out. But I'll show you how to do that. The other thing I've got is a ruler for making sure the chassis is straight before you put the motor back in. And most importantly, masking tape. This is how wide is this? About 25mm or an inch. And I basically wrap this around the motor when I'm putting it in. So that basically acts as a spacer, so the motor sits ever so slightly higher than the chassis, so it doesn't drag against the track. I've just got an old brush here, so once you take the motor out, you can just flick all the solder off, just to make it nice and clean again. And the most importantly, a Maplin's receipt. So basically, what I use this for sometimes is you take a little section, and when you put in the motor in, you actually put that in between the two gears and use that as a spacer to get the perfect gear mesh. But more on that later. Let's focus on taking the motor out first. So first thing you need to do is take the lead wires off. So I've got my 25 watt Hakko soldering iron, really good. 25 watt doesn't sound like a lot, but it's got some special thermal recovery, they call it, and yeah, honestly it's really good. So I'll take a little dab of solder on the end just to help with the heat conductivity, and then just put that on the wire, heat it up, and as soon as it's melted you can just pull it off. Same with the other one. Easy as that. Okay, to take the motor out, well, I've actually just realised that this motor isn't put in properly. So I'll put it in properly, just bear with me for a sec. You don't need to worry about this bit. Right, just to kind of do it properly. So taking a motor out, you've got, most cars will have two solder joints holding the motor in. You know, there's different ways you can take it out. There's two main methods that I see. One is heating up both solder joints and gently sort of twisting it out every time. And the other doesn't work all the time, but you know, sometimes you can use a blade and slide it in between the chassis and the motor to break that solder joint, and then you just heat the other one up and it falls out. So I'm going to go with the good old prying method, because this is Jack's car, and you know, it's only Jack, isn't it? bit worried about this camera. It's hanging off of, well, basically I've jammed a metal rod underneath my light and then hung the camera strap on top of that, so it's a bit dodgy, but hopefully it will hold up. Okay, so taking the motor out, I always find a little bit of acid flux just helps sort of with the heat conductivity. Don't really know why, it just seems to help. So the first thing I'll do is just try and build up a bit of heat in both solder joints. I'll start off with the pinion side. Remember, a little blob of solder on the end of the iron just to help with the heat. So that's melted, that's flowing really nicely. Just keep the heat on for a bit, and then once you've done that, put it on the other side. And there's no rush, you just need to build up the heat a little bit but not too much, or you wreck the magnets. The hotter the magnets get, the easier they lose their magnetic field. And then you heat up the other side again, shove the screwdriver in that gap, and just gently pry it out, and it comes out like that. So you can see now, possibly, if the camera will focus, that is. For a little bit close. Well, basically, this solder joint is no longer attached. So all I've got to do now is heat up the other side, and it will just fall out. There you have it. That's how you take the motor out. Okay, then to put it back in, the first thing you've got to do is make sure there's no rust on the chassis. Because if there's rust on the chassis, then solder's not going to stick to rust, is it? And then about halfway through the race, your motor will fall out, so it's not ideal. So to get rid of the rust, you might use just a Dremel with a cutting disc on the end and just sort of scrape it away. Or if you really want to go fancy, you can get a carbon steel wire brush. They're really good for getting rid of rust. Get those on eBay really cheap. So yeah, if there's no rust, you're alright. All you got to do is just clean up the rough solder from where you took the motor out. So just a tiny little bit of acid flux. And just sort of rub the soldering iron over it. You might also want to use a brush if you've got loads of solder. Just try and flick it off into the bin. Or a solder sucker maybe. I've got one of those somewhere, but I don't really like it. I think a brush is a lot easier. Yeah, so once you've cleaned up the chassis, you can put that to one side. Now if you take a look at the motor, we've got a massive blob of solder just there. This camera's rubbish. So what we're going to do is just heat that up and flick it off into the bin. I can't really show you that because my bin is sort of on my right, and I don't want to move the camera because it's set up perfectly. Which it's also about to run out of battery, but never mind. Yeah, so what we do is, I'll show you now. What I do is sort of hold the soldering iron and the brush in the same hand, so I can sort of hold the motor carefully without burning myself. Heat up that solder joint, and as soon as it's melted, just flick it off into the bin. So I'll just do that quickly. Okay, so once you've done that, this camera really does not focus, but once you've done that, it basically cleans it up so you're ready to put it back in again. You know, you've got to be careful of all the little bits of solder attaching to the magnets, so you can just get the brush again and just sort of flick it all off. So that's basically the motor prepared, ready to go in. And then if I try and show you, If your chassis is bent, the back of the car won't sit flat on the block. This one's alright actually. This one's looking pretty good. Good job there, Jack. Very straight chassis. Yeah, I mean, if the chassis not touching the block, when you put the motor in, the motor's going to hang below the chassis, and you don't want that. So, if you can't get the chassis perfectly straight or touching the block, what I do is take this 1-inch masking tape, just a short piece, and actually wrap that around the motor. Like that. Okay, so I've just run out of memory, which is very bad timing because I put the motor in, run out of memory just before I put the motor in, so I had to take it out again. But who cares? So this is where we left off. Had a bit of tape wrapped around the motor. So on the bottom of the motor and around the back, and that acts as a spacer to stop the axle touching the motor. So you got your car on the block. Make sure the back is flat. You know, it's not up in the air. You know, try to get as low as you can. Best touching the block. If you can't get it touching, there might be a bit of dirt underneath the chassis or on the block, or there might be a slight kink in the chassis which is lifting it up. You know, if you just can't figure it out, it's not the end of the world. You can always wrap 2 layers of masking tape around the motor to sort that out. But here we've got 1 because the chassis sits very flat on the block. So you might want to use a receipt or a bit of fag paper or something as a spacer in between the gears. I'm not going to bother. I'm just going to do it by feel because I can sort of. I think I'm getting more accurate that way. But yeah, so basically, just if you're going to do it by feel, you just put the motor in and push it up against the back axle and just sort of pivot it on the back axle like that. And that's going to bring the 2 gears either together or further apart. And what I like to do is just bring the 2 gears together and just give the gear a little bit of a wiggle. So what you're doing is kind of feeling how much slop there is in between the teeth of the gears. And you want it pretty much as small as you can get it, but not so there's nothing. So I'd say, I don't know, about as much side play as you'd have in the rear axle. About that, same sort of feel. But if you're struggling, you can always just use a receipt or a bit of fag paper in between the 2 gears. So once you've found the perfect gear mesh, it's a little bit tricky, but you want to sort of rest your palm of your hand on the chassis, or the edge of your hand, sort of there, to stop the chassis moving, and then grab the motor and hold that dead still, because if that moves, you're going to get a funny gear mesh. So once you've got that in the right place, you can take a bit of flux and put that down where the motor touches the chassis. And try and be generous with the flux. Doesn't matter if you put too much on, you can always clean it off after. I take my soldering iron and I use I've got a chisel tip, and I like to use the edge of the tip to get right in that gap. So that's what we do. A fair amount of solder, better more than too little. And don't worry about the heat. Just keep the heat on and let the solder flow. So it's a nice strong tack joint. So at the moment the motor's held in there by a very, very small amount of solder, so it's not very strong. And once you've got that tack joint, you can check how tight the gears are. You can either go, no, it's a little bit too tight, or it's a little bit too loose. I actually think that's a little bit too tight. I must have moved or something, so it's a bit embarrassing, but so you just heat it up again, and give it a very, very small twist to get the gears slightly further apart or closer together, depending on how you're done. So once you're happy with that, well, what you can do, I don't usually do this anymore, but what I used to do is just connect the crocodile clips from your power supply to the motor and just give it a quick rev. And that sounds awful, really, if I'm honest. It's not too bad. It sounds a little bit rough at the moment, but that can easily be sorted out later. And I'll show you that actually later on. So I'm gonna leave that gear mesh because I know that I'll be able to fix it later. But if you wanted to, just move it a little bit further back. Yeah, so that's a nice gear mesh. So what we can do now is just very carefully take off this masking tape. Because remember, the motor's only held in by a very, very small solder joint, so you don't want to go yanking the tape off, or it might cause the motor to fall out and you'll have to start again. Okay, very carefully pull that out. Right, now what I like to do at this point is make sure the motor isn't hanging below the chassis, so I take a ruler, place it across the back of the car and just have a look really. And I can either go, yeah, that's good, or no, it's hanging below. And if it is hanging below, sometimes you can sort of get away with it and just sort of bend the motor up a little bit. But if it's too low on this side, you might have to take it out, put another bit of masking tape around it to raise it up a bit. But that's okay at the moment, so I'm going to go ahead and do the other solder joint. So when I do the other solder joint, I'm going to be using flux, and I don't really want to get flux on the rear axle, so I'm going to loosen that gear off and take the whole rear axle out of the car. You don't have to, but just to stop it getting flux on it, it's just a little bit easier. So it also makes it easier to get the soldering iron on there as well. So you can take a bit of flux again and put that on the rear solder joint. And don't do what some people do. I've done it when I started out. You go, right, and let's make this solder joint proper, and you heat that solder joint up, and then the motor falls out. So you have to make sure you do the rear joint now, because if you heat up that joint, it's just going to melt the tack that's holding it in. It will fall out. I see quite a lot of people do that. It's and you tell them what's going on, and they go, "Oh right, I get it now." So quite a lot of solder on the rear joint. So I'll pick it up on the soldering iron. Already got flux on the motor, and yeah, you basically just sort of put it on there and move it up and down and let it sort of flow round like that. And then sometimes what I might do is look at the top of the chassis, add a little bit more flux and a little bit more solder to the other side just to strengthen it up a bit. You can also do this on the block if you find it easier. Sort of find it easier to do it in mid-air. But what you don't want to do is this. Rest it on a block like that. Because when you heat up this solder joint, it's going to push the motor up and out of the chassis, so it's going to sit in the car like that. So I find it's easier to hold it in mid-air. So that's that one done. And remember, this solder joint is only tacked in place, so we can go back make that nice and strong now, just by using a bit of flux and only a little bit of solder. It depends on how well tacked in place it is. And you just sort of keep the heat on and just move the soldering iron left to right. It just makes it flow round really nicely. See if I can focus in on this. There we go. So the solder joints are nice and neat, but there's quite a lot of black marks around it. That's the flux. So to get rid of that, if you're in a rush, just grab a bit of lighter fluid and a paper towel. Just pour that on and just sort of get right in there, inside that groove, and just sort of rub it all off. That works great with stainless steel chassis. This is a stainless steel chassis. If you've got a spring steel chassis, they go rusty very, very easily. So what I've got is, it's not in here actually, it's called sugar soap. It's basically a yellow liquid which is a degreaser. You pour some of that on, get a nasty old toothbrush, go over it like that with some hot water, and it just gets all of the flux off. It's really good stuff. That's called sugar soap, and that's it's pretty cheap as well. So yeah, if you're gonna be looking after your chassis and making sure they're clean so they don't go rusty, I definitely recommend getting some sugar soap. So that's all the way in the bathroom, and I can't be bothered to go get it. It's only Jack's car, so we'll just clean it with light fluid. It works fine for stainless steel chassis because they're a lot more resistant to rust than a spring steel chassis. So you have to go everywhere where you put flux. So that includes the most obvious places are this side of the chassis. But you've really also got to do this side, so on top of that rear motor joint. You make sure you get right in there, do a good job on this because you'll regret it when it goes rusty, because next time you want to go put a motor in, you'll really struggle because solder doesn't adhere to rust. This is a pipe cleaner. I've got it in the bag here. Dr. Plum's Perfect Pipe Cleaners. And yeah, they're great for getting in the little gaps. But yeah, that's really how you put a motor in. What we've got to do now is attach the wires. It's a really easy job. You just take a blob of solder. You don't really need any flux if both surfaces are tinned. Especially if you use flux cored solder like I do, it sort of does it on its own. Make sure you get the wires the right way round, otherwise your car will be going backwards around the track. Okay, so that's the motor put in. If you remember earlier, that gear mesh was a little bit, it wasn't quite perfect. So I'll show you my top secret trick for getting rid of that. Sometimes you'll put a motor in, it'll have that noise and you'll go bugger, and you'll try and move it, make it better, and no matter what you do, it will always have that horrible sound on the gears. And this is how you get rid of it. So I attach the wires, the crocodile clips from the power supply. See how it sounds first. Not brilliant. It's not bad, but it's not brilliant. So here's my trick. Rev it up at, I don't know, about 4.5 volts. And you take your finger and just push the axle that way. Because it's an angled gear, it will tighten the gear mesh and basically run the gears in for you. And it will sound horrible and you'll be thinking, oh, what is he doing? But trust me, it works. I might turn the volts up a little bit. That's on 6 volts now. And that is a much better gear mesh now. And that really does make a difference, that just pushing the axle over and running the gears in really makes the mesh very smooth. I think that's pretty much it. That's how you take a motor out and put a motor in. I've probably missed a few things, but yeah, that's it really. So hope you enjoyed that. I'll take the camera off of this suspension unit thing up there. That is a brilliant setup. That's a brass rod jammed underneath my light. I'm going to take a closer look now. Oh, come on. Oh, this camera's awful. Right, there you go. So, you know, it's something that takes practice, putting a motor in, getting a feel for the right gear mesh, and consistently getting them in and getting them not hanging below the chassis. But you know, if you're just starting out, I'd say take an old chassis and just take that, get an old motor and just put it in and take it out again, put it in, take it out, put it in, take it out, and just keep practicing, because the more you practice, the better you're going to get. When I started, I was awful at putting motors in. You know, the solder joints would be all over the place, but with a bit of extra flux, not too much solder, you can get them really smooth. The actual solder I'm using is it's called rosin core. It has got lead in it, but it's really good stuff, because it keeps your soldering iron really clean as well. And that's the tip, and I've had that on there for at least a year, and it's you know, it's the bits I use are actually pretty much spotless. There's not really much wear on there either. So yeah, rosin core flux, really good. So quit blabbering on. Thanks for watching, and I hope you found this useful. See you later.